Hi, everyone. This is part 3 of my series on Jesus called Christ Was No Christian, so who was he? And in this series, I'm talking about how Jesus is bigger than either atheism or religion, how all our conventional ideas about Jesus are wrong. He's bigger and more important than almost anyone realizes. So here's part 3. Go to my website, buy my books, do everything, like the video, subscribe to my channel, do it all. Just do it all 24 hours a day. Okay, here's part 3. In part 2 of this series, and go back and listen to that if you haven't, that's my recommendation, I said that when I first read about Jesus in the Gospels, it startled me because I didn't see a connection between this vibrant spirit and Christianity as an institution and priests and churches and all that stuff. And I said Jesus glowed like a fire. Here's part 3, the landscape. If I experienced the Jesus of the Gospels as a kind of fire, to his early followers, he must have felt more like rain. Some people are like that. They come in all walks of life with different predilections and skills. Some nurture and hone their gifts. Some mishandle them. Some ignore them. No one knows why this or that person comes into this world so overflowing. They're just graced. They have charisma. Some are spiritual teachers. Some are entertainers. Some are artists, athletes, or political leaders. These people radiate something. They shine lights into darkness. They show us what is possible. They do not, in Ralph Waldo Emerson's words, go where the path may lead, but go instead where there is no path and leave a trail. Robin Williams, Michael Jordan, Oprah Winfrey, Steve Jobs, Mother Teresa, Malala, Bob Dylan, Martin Luther King Jr., Joan of Arc, Albert Einstein, Siddhartha Gautama. Some are saints, many are not. Such gifts can bring trouble to an insufficiently developed personality. Tapping into that power can go to the heads of those who don't fully understand its source in the universal ground of being. Traditional societies recognized some such people as shamans. Depending on which translation you read, Matthew 7:29 tells us that people were astonished, amazed, or stunned when they heard Jesus teach. For he spoke, quote, with authority and not like the legalists they were used to. Even more than his words, though, it was Christ's miraculous healings that got people's attention. This wasn't someone who dropped a coin in the cup of a beggar as he hurried by to a speaking engagement. This was a man who stopped in the dusty street, laid his hands on a smelly, sun-baked leper, and healed him. Jesus brought rain you could feel on your face. And even more than our own, Jesus' world needed rain. The poor and the sick always struggle. In Christ's time, though, there were no safety nets, no charitable organizations, no governments that even in theory protected the equal rights of its people. When the Jewish peasants of first century Judea looked to their masters above, they could expect nothing but the pitiless fist of Rome and a largely corrupt Jewish elite of wealthy priests and landowners who either exploited or ignored them. Often these two overlords, the Romans and the Jewish elite, were enmeshed in both official and unofficial symbiosis. 9 out of 10 people in ancient Palestine were poor peasants living at the subsistence level, heavily taxed and often in debt. If you ran out of food or had nowhere to live, well, that was your problem. And it wasn't only the politics. Whether Jewish or Roman, the reigning worldviews of Jesus' time tended to steamroll over the most vulnerable humans. Ancient Romans, like the Greeks before them, took it as a given, quote, that by a necessity of their nature, men always rule when they have the power. According to historian Donald Kagan, our classical forebears saw the world as, quote, a place of intense competition in which victory and domination, which brought fame and glory, were the highest goals, while defeat and subordination brought ignominy and shame, close quotes. For Romans, inequality, quote, was thought to be natural or at least inevitable, end quote. With the exception of a few powerful personalities, women were second-class citizens with no political sway. Even Jesus' native Judaism, with its rich moral traditions, subordinated women, stoned blasphemers to death, permitted slavery, and venerated a God who could order the slaughter of the women and children of those who stood in his righteous path. According to the Torah, sickness and deformity weren't just physical afflictions, but indications of impurity before God. Cripples could only go so far into the holy temple in Jerusalem, while lepers were forbidden to have any contact with the rest of society. If you were sick, there was some hope for a cure, as long as you could afford it. Money bought you not just the best health care, as it does today, but the only health care. Healers, exorcists, and miracle workers, quote, were skilled and fairly well-paid professions in first-century Palestine, end quote. Once healed, though, you could be looking at another pile of shekels. Jewish law required elaborate and costly ritual cleansing for those hoping to be let back into God's good graces. Not coincidentally, these rituals also resulted in wealthy, well-fed temple priests. The law of Moses required a healed leper, for example, to scrape together 2 clean birds, some cedar wood, crimson yarn, and hyssop. One bird was to be sacrificed. The meat was kept by the priest for that night's appetizer, while the second bird was to be released. The cedar wood, yarn, and hyssop were to be dipped in the first bird's blood, which also had to be sprinkled on the head of the leper. 7 days later, after shaving their head and bathing, the leper was required, in a land often ravaged by famine, to bring in 2 male lambs without blemish, as well as an offering of choice flour mixed with oil. The priest must sacrifice both lambs and once again set the meat aside for his later enjoyment, then smear the lamb's blood in specific spots on the leper's body and sprinkle the oil over his head 7 times. As historian Reza Aslan writes, quote, only after all this is complete shall the leper be considered free of the sin and guilt that led to his leprosy in the first place. Only then shall he be allowed to rejoin the community of God. End quote. Jesus, on the other hand, didn't think you'd ever left the community of God. Neither was he out to make a buck, or a name, or a career. He didn't care how poor or sick you were, or how invisible or impure to the powers that be. Perhaps most shockingly of all to the sensibilities of his culture, he also didn't care if you were a woman. To Jesus, everyone was simply a human being. That was unprecedented and life-giving. The 20th century Spanish poet Antonio Machado imagined that we each have a garden entrusted to us in our souls, a garden with the potential to bloom under the right conditions. In the aridness of the brutal, patriarchal landscape of his time, Jesus watered seeds that lay dormant in the souls of those with ears to hear. Seeds of self-recognition. This powerful, charismatic man cares about people like me. I matter in this universe. Me, a peasant, a woman, a prostitute, a cripple, a leper, a slave. In the next video, part 4, I'm going to talk about the effect that Jesus had on the people around him and his crucifixion. I'll link that video at the end of this one, and if it's not there when you watch this video, it will be there soon.